Sailors, what's the creepiest thing you've seen or experienced at sea? Posted one day ago. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Not a sailor, but I've spent more time out at sea than most because of my fondness for most boat-related stuff. Even though I enjoy being out there, it always has kind of an eerie feel. I live in the south of Norway, and the North Sea is really dark. Even on the most beautiful days, you can max see a meter down. Well, this one time I was out by myself, in a pretty small, about 14 feet boat. It was one of those not sunny, but still adequate weather days. Well, long story short, I lost control over the engine and my boat spun around, landing me just underneath it. As I mentioned in another post, I have never felt as vulnerable as just then, floating at the top of a big nothing. You know there is nothing for possibly hundreds of feet underneath you. Probably the worst part of it is when you have to duck under the boat to get up and away. You just stare down into the abyss. You can choose not to look, but then it's almost just worse. There are no big sharks or that sort here, but still, you feel like there's just something down there in the dark. I managed to keep calm, and after about half an hour, someone must have spotted me because I was soon picked up by the local search and rescue boat. I still don't like to look down into the water, but I will continue enjoying the sea as long as I'm above the surface. On a boat in Alaska recording humpback whale sounds, we picked up an odd rhythmic noise on the hydrophone. We were on a 100-foot schooner around Admiralty Island near Juneau. Nothing seen on the surface, just this odd, repetitious mechanical sound. The skipper contacted the local authorities, who seized the tape and spent several hours interviewing him. Not that scary, but surely weird. A few years ago, one of my buddies lost his life on the flight deck. His body wasn't flown off until a few days after the incident. Still feels creepy to walk around the ship at night, like I'll see his ghost or something. I'm not sure this is exactly what you're looking for, but I spent several years as a mechanic on an aircraft carrier. Every single one of us in my division has stories like this. I was on watch in the propulsion plant while we were in port, so I was the only one in there. I saw a sailor I didn't recognize rounding a corner, so I hurried over to challenge him. Most people on the ship weren't authorized to be down there. When I got around the corner, there was nobody there. Another time, I saw a large, heavy bolted down water tank move itself a foot or so. I sat down on the deck and just stared at it for like 20 minutes until I came to my senses. Despite being legitimately spooked by this stuff, we pretty much all agreed that we were hallucinating due to exhaustion and not compounding fatigue. Not that the plant was haunted or anything, but who knows, maybe it was. I woke up to take a piss. Head was occupied, went to the stern. The entire sea behind the boat was glowing blue. My piss stream made these beautiful colors of aquamarine and violet. Thought I was hallucinating or dreaming and went back to bed. I stayed awake petrified I had died and was in some sort of alternate reality or something. Told no one for years. Found a video online. Apparently it's a type of bioluminescent algae. It effed with me for far longer than it should. We had a noise shine down on us my second time out. We were smoking, and our bridge also heard, confirmed it. It was a pretty bright, starry night, but this one area was a little brighter and had this dull, washed-out shaft appearance to it, a lot like seeing the Milky Way overhead in the sky. We passed right by it, and there was a cyclical sound like somewhere between a humming and sort of siren. It wasn't loud, almost more of a frequency, about 3 or 4 miles wide, maybe, coming down not quite vertically. We could see it every time we checked for over an hour behind us. Then we checked, and it was totally gone. I wasn't horrified or anything, but the creepy part was how quiet everyone was. We all just kind of looked at each other and cracked a few nervous jokes. Not as juicy as seeing the Flying Dutchman or something like that, but I still think about it every time I see the night sky. Scariest thing? No doubt the 40, 50, 60-foot crests and being at a 45-degree angle for like 10 seconds at a time. Merchant Marine officer here. We rescued a guy in a sailboat who had an infection on his ass, a huge boil. We had to lance it and squeeze out the pus. I almost passed out, it was so gnarly. I've seen weird lights in the sky, but it's most likely caused by superducting atmospheric conditions. I have seen ball lightning, Been in 50-foot seas, where the entire 1,000-foot container ship was flexing like a wet noodle. It's amazing what those ships can withstand. Saw a submarine periscope breach the surface. I don't know, nothing too crazy. Not sure if it's considered creepy, but kind of unnerving. I was active duty Navy for 4 years based on a destroyer out of Japan. I'd say I'd seen it all, but this story really stuck with me. We were putting around when we get a distress call from a cargo ship about 100 miles or so away. It wasn't them in distress, but another boat, and they were relaying it out to get some help. We responded, met up with the cargo ship en route. There was something cool about that, a US Navy warship meeting up a cargo vessel from like Australia or some shit to rescue some Thai fishermen. By the time we got on scene, another ship was there and was doing circles looking for the crew. We found the fishing vessel about 90% submerged underwater, only the bow was still above the water. Unfortunately, we were not able to find any crew members. We found a few empty flotation devices, but no crew. We stayed on scene looking around for a few hours, even sending out our choppers. Ultimately, we had to call it as we had another prior mission to take care of. We left the cargo ship and other ship to look, but really, I don't think either of them found anything. To this day, I'm not sure what caused that fishing boat to sink, and it's sad to see the boat, but no crew. My granddad's brother, great uncle, was in the Navy for the majority of his life. I loved when he'd visit because he'd always tell me cool stories. Most were just of storms or cool things that have happened to him, but one stuck with me. He was in the North Sea, and it was a particularly bad storm. He and his friends were convinced they saw Viking longships. He was ridiculed every time he brought it up, but he never faltered from his story. No big flashy event or anything other than a group around about a dozen Viking longboats rowing through the storm. He told it way better, but to this day I believe him. It's the only time he ever mentioned anything even slightly creepy like that. A friend of mine and his mate got a job to sail a yacht from Rio to Cape Town. A while after they got back, I went drinking with my mate, and after we'd had a few, he says something weird happened to him on the boat. It was around sunset, and he looked up to see a man in a suit standing near him. The man tells him to come, and the next thing he remembers, he's floating in the fetal position down in metallic corridors. He seemed to almost go into a trance, describing looking into the bays as he was floating past and seeing people and creatures being examined and experimented on. Next thing he remembers, he's back on the boat, and it's just after sunset. Cool story, bro. A month or so later, I bump into his friend in another bar, and again, after getting pretty hammered, this guy starts telling me the same story. I'm like, nuh-uh, you guys came up with this bullshit story between yourselves. Too much confusion. So much so that we caught a cab to my mate's place, and I sat and watched them piece the story together. I'm pretty sure they didn't concoct the story. I wouldn't say it's creepy, but just scary. I have a buddy who's a submariner. They were on deployment for 6 months and were told they were going to be extended 45 days. One of my buddy's best friends waited till he was asleep and attacked him with a knife. He tried cutting his throat open. Thankfully, the knife didn't get deep enough. No one expected this guy to do anything like that. When you're stuck in a tin can, it changes people. You don't see the sun for 6 months. You don't have contact with your family or friends. That's one of the creepiest stories I've heard. The absolute worst story was not witnessed by myself, but my chief engineer during his early days of sailor life. At the time, he was working on a general cargo ship. As he usually woke up very early in the mornings, he went to the aft ship to have a smoke. On his way back, he went past the window of the galley kitchen and thought he saw something that was a bit off. He went back and had a good look inside, and lo and behold, the cook was standing there pounding his cock in the bread dough, literally taking care of his morning wood in the bread dough that he fed to the rest of the crew for breakfast. He decided not telling the rest of the crew, since they for sure would have killed the cook and thrown him to sea for what he did. Instead, my chief shut his mouth for the rest of the trip and never ate the bread anymore. Next story was from a tank ship I was working on. A few years before I joined this ship was a heavy seas. The electrician was doing an inspection of the switchboards when he lost his balance when one of the waves struck the ship. He then went on and hit his head straight in the main electrical beam inside the switchboard. 440 volts straight through the head. He died instantly, and it was very morbid for the rest of the crew to find him. I have a few more as well, but not as dramatic as those above. P.S. One time, we were ashore in Trinidad, getting drunk. We thought it would be a great idea to take the rescue boat to go to Venezuela because they had very pretty girls there. Nobody had passports or anything. Luckily, one guy was smart enough to convince us that it was a terrible idea and we would go to jail for sure if we went. 1. I was serving on a Coast Guard vessel in the Barents Sea in the late 1990s. This is an area very rich with fish, so a big part of the Coast Guard's job in the area was policing, rescuing, and inspecting fishing ships. The closest coastline to the Barents Sea is the Russian Kola Peninsula, so the majority of the fishing vessels there were Russian. One day, while patrolling the area, we noticed a fishing ship moving in a strange pattern. Usually the trawlers would move like in a herd, following the fish stems, but this vessel would keep moving in and out of the fleet, and often moving up right next to the other ships in the fleet before moving out again. This seemed to us as very strange behavior for a fishing ship, so we decided to send out a boarding party to inspect the vessel. I was on this party. When we came aboard, to our surprise, there were no fishing equipment on the deck, and it didn't seem like the boat had been trawling at all. Still, we had to do a proper inspection and see what was in the cargo. When we moved inside the boat, we noticed that a lot of the lights inside the boat were changed to red, and there was a smell of old booze and sweat instead of the normal smell of fish. We came into the cargo hold. It was even stranger when the cargo hold also turned out to be empty, so they were not supplying the fleet or taking the catch to shore. On our way up to the bridge, we suddenly figured out what was going on. One of the crew lookers had no door, and the bunk beds inside were filled with scantily dressed Russian girls. It turned out it was a floating brothel servicing the fishermen out at sea. That might not seem as much to some, but to an 18-year-old Norwegian, it made me realize how good my life was compared to these people living across the border, especially considering both the girls and the fishermen were around my own age. 2. This is not me, but my father, who was a commercial sailor for the 50s to the 70s. He was on a tanker crossing the Pacific Ocean. They were far from land and kind of in the middle of the ocean. The Pacific Ocean is big, very big, so the chance of meeting other vessels out there is very slim. Still, one night, when it was completely dark, dots started to appear on the radar. This was in the 60s, so radar technology wasn't close to what it is today. So my father went out to the bridge wing to see if he could see any lanterns. Nothing. When he came back to the bridge, he saw that the radar were now completely covered with dots all around the ship. Big dots too, but still not a single lantern in sight. My father thought it must be a malfunction or some weather causing it. Still, the water was flat and the weather seemed calm, so he made a call on the radio for any ships in the area. Immediately, he got an answer from an American voice. It turned out he managed to cross paths with an American carrier group on maneuver in the middle of the Pacific. He then requested if they turn their lights on so he could maneuver safely out of their fleet. Suddenly, within a few seconds, as he described it, it was like a whole city materialized out of the darkness around them. From horizon to horizon, there were huge carriers, supply ships, escort ships, and whatnot. The contrast of being alone in the vast ocean for days to this was very strange. He managed to maneuver the tanker through the myriad ships, and when he came to the outskirts of the fleet, suddenly, as soon as they appeared, the whole fleet went completely dark again, gone. Once again, the ship was totally alone in the vast, dark ocean. He described the encounter as the strangest feeling he experienced during 30 years at sea. Leading seaman here, nothing scarier than doing a round, walking around exterior decks checking rooms for fires and such, when the ship is underway at night, so it's pitch black and only a red flashlight for light, and the ship's engines are very loud. I always get the sense there's something following you in the dark. If you fell in, no one would know for at least 20 minutes or much more. Was sailing on a tall ship in the open sea. Good breeze, so making 12 plus knots, and heeled over so hard that over the rail you were almost looking straight into the water. Out of nowhere, a dark gray shape, maybe 20 feet long, pulls right up alongside us, just paces us for 1 to 2 minutes, right over the starboard rail and keeping up like it's nothing. Then it rolls over, and we see a bright white belly before it disappears under the waves. To this day, I have no idea what it was. Not a sailor, but I jumped off the back of a boat when I was a teenager a few miles out to sea just to see what it was like. You jump in, and then every direction you look other than up just fades into a bottomless, seeming empty black abyss. Never in my life had I really felt so vulnerable and at the complete mercy of my current surroundings. Creepy, surreal, would absolutely recommend doing at least once. A mild one, but I was sailing a race at sea in Belgium, Ostend, and had capsized, so was dead last. And right before the finish, the water was crowded with roses, hundreds of flowers just floating there. Because I was last and the direction of the tide, I was the first to see it, and it was very confusing. That same race, I thought I saw a log up ahead, got closer, and it moved, then realized it was a seal. I was about 2-3 meters away at that point in my little laser. Absolutely insane experience. Was on watch in an armory late at night when I heard a large boom and they called engineering teams away. I sent my kids out to make sure none of our ordnance was to blame. Turns out it was a tsunami heading towards Southeast Asia, and I went from thinking that deployment might be shortened to great, we're getting extended. Not creepy, but odd. I was out fishing in the Gulf of Mexico off Sarasota with my best friend in a 21-foot center console. In the summer, there can be multiple small thunderstorms around you, but you can navigate in between them. One time a rainbow developed at the edge of the misty rain was right on our boat. We were literally in the end of the rainbow, prismatic colors all around us. You could look up and see the rainbow going up from there. It was one of the coolest things I've ever experienced. Quarterdeck in port required ID to board the ship. Everyone, captain, executive officers, no exception, happened to be around and was amused when I saw the ship's bosun going up to the quarterdeck with his usual morning mug of whiskey and coffee, so I stopped to watch. His nickname on the low was Skeletor, and the ship's bosun is god of everything on the deck of the ship. Nobody had ever seen him smile or even grin, just a scowl. I'll never forget the look when they tried to ID him. He paused as if considering throwing the bosun's mate of the watch into the ocean, then kept walking. Exception to every rule. I don't know if I count as a sailor, but I used to do voluntary sea rescue as a kid. We were having an exercise where they dropped 6 of us to the middle of the sea in a small rescue raft. We didn't have enough room to sit comfortably. The objective was to stay there for the night and radio the station every 30 minutes as a test how well we can estimate the passage of time. Well, we were sitting in the raft about 4 hours in when all just heard the creepiest sound ever, like a wandering soul screaming. I instantly popped out of the tent-shaped raft to check if the others were pulling a prank on us, but I saw nobody. And, remind you, this happened on empty seas, with the closest island a kilometer away, so I would have noticed any pranksters. Sailed in the Navy 03 to 07, never saw anything like supernatural creepy, but for what it's worth, on a search and rescue mission off the coast of Virginia, do absolutely not ever swim drunk in the ocean at night or alone, people. I was on a small flight deck of my frigate, which was lined with sailors all the way around searching the waters. Then we heard servo motors kick on, and everyone looked up to find our phalanx gun was tracking a contact. Now, a phalanx gun is basically just a T-800 before we invented legs for it. It's an automated Gatling gun that spits out 3,000 rounds per minute to create a wall of bullets to vaporize any supersonic air contacts trying to pass by it without permission. And we're off the coast of Virginia, so there's no enemies up there, aircraft or missiles, which means somewhere up there in the night sky is a passenger jet full of people who have no idea a robotic 20mm Gatling gun is now aimed directly at them. Now, it almost certainly wasn't even loaded with 20mm tungsten carbide point armor penetrating rounds at the time, and it can't actually shoot itself without specific human approval, but it was still a little unnerving that a robot gun was pointing itself at a bunch of civilians anyway. Muzzle control phalanx, muzzle control, and then you think, gee, I guess anytime I'm flying near an ocean, there's a non-zero probability that some dumb Navy death ray is pointing itself directly up my a-hole for no reason. My father used to work on boats occasionally as a safety officer for the Navy, but never when they were actually at sea. He'd make sure all the correct procedures were being followed, deliver training sessions, etc. One day, he was finished giving a seminar in the canteen, and when everyone else had left, an old man tapped him on the shoulder and asked him what he was doing there. My father told him, and the old guy looked upset and stormed off, muttering to himself. My father naturally was left baffled, having never seen the man before. He asked people back at the base who the guy was and why he was so pissed off, but no one had a clue who he was talking about. You needed pretty serious security clearance to get on board, so it should have been impossible for a civilian to embark. To this day, he still has no clue what happened, but he was pretty spooked for the next few days.